Hi there, BookTube. It's the very end of December as I'm recording this, and this is my best books review of the year of 2021. And I'm just going to do the classic BookTubers moan about lighting. It's a really miserable, foggy, horrible day here in Sussex in England. And so I've had to put the overhead light on because natural light isn't enough, and I've probably got like a bit of a halo. But it may be grey and miserable out there, but I'm very jolly because when I look back over my year's reading, I thought, what a lot of brilliant books I've got to recommend to everyone out there that kind of shares BookTube with me. I actually finished 152 books this year, which is an exceptionally large number for me for various reasons. Partly COVID related, and I wouldn't normally read quite so many as that in a year. But that does mean that in selecting ones to talk about, there's so many wonderful books that I'm leaving out, so many things that I've really enjoyed. But what I've decided that I will do is I'm only going to talk about 5-star books. Now, I know rating things like giving stars is very, reductive and a bit daft, but when you read, it does help me, I think, to look back at my year and think, oh yeah, that was a 5-star, and oh, why didn't I give that one 5 stars when it's really stuck in my mind? So it's a useful tool, and I've used that to select what I'm going to talk about in the video. But also, I'm excluding any 5-star reads that were like rereads, so to narrow it down a little bit further. That still leaves me with quite a lot though, because I had a really good year's reading. So I'm going to split this by kind of types of books, like short stories or poetry collections, and give you my sort of top few for each. Although with non-fiction and contemporary novels, I'll give you a full kind of 10-to-1 rated my top 10s. And I might split this into halfway, we might get a part 1 and a part 2 so that both bits aren't too long. Let's go. I'm going to start with the things that I read least of as a type. Okay, and the thing that I read least of was graphic novels and graphic non-fiction, and that's something that I hope to read more of in the coming year. But I was just starting to try and do that, and did read how many? I think 5. I read 5, and 2 of those were 5-star reads, so that I was choosing carefully, I guess. And so number 2 of my top 2 of graphic novels was I actually rated it 4 stars when I read it, but it was really stuck in my mind. And when I thought about it, I thought, no, it qualifies as a 5-star read. It's Embroideries by Marjane Satrapi, who's a French-Iranian author, grew up in Iran, moved to France. And she's written a brilliant memoir, or series of memoirs, Persepolis. But this is like a kind of almost like a coda to those books, because it's a brilliantly funny little graphic kind of memoir, again, about the sort of love lives and sex lives of Iranian women. Really funny, really touching, really thoughtful. And she just conjures up with her, the reason I thought it deserved 5 stars is she conjures up a character, a personality with like really simple, drawing, but it just, you can see, oh yeah, you feel them when you look at it. But my number 1 graphic novel of the year, of the 5, was one called In by Will McPhail, and he's Scottish, I think, but does cartoons for the New Yorker, and it's funny, it's intensely moving. There's a lot about loneliness and grief and so on in there, and illness. It's beautifully drawn, and it really uses the graphic side of a graphic novel to the full, for like visual jokes or to convey emotional atmosphere. Definitely a winner, and I'm hoping for more like that in the year to come. Now, next smallest group, as it were, was short story collections, and not surprisingly, because I'm not a huge short story fan, But of the 7 that I read, 3 were 5-star reads. So again, some good choosing, I think. I'm going to rate them sort of 3 to 1. In at number 3 was Great Escapes from Detroit by Joseph O'Malley, also known on BookTube as The Wonderful Two-Tatler And his collection of short stories, his collection, is, I suppose, it's at the realist end of short stories. You know, they're like little snapshots, like vignettes of people's lives, but where you feel like you're taken right into their life in this little short chunk. I really enjoyed those. Number 2, going upwards, is this the Aleph and Other Stories, Borges. I can't believe that it's taken me to the age of 57 to pick up something by him, because I've heard about him so often. It was just as good as its reputation says it is, and I'm really pleased to read it for 2 reasons, and would highly recommend it for 2 reasons. One is, it's fantastic in both senses of the word. It's fantastic as in wonderful, and fantastic as in fantasy, but also it's so influential, and I've seen it referenced, his work, so many times in other things that I've read, that including something I'm reading currently, which I'll talk about when I talk about my December reading. That was short stories. And then what was the top one? The top one, number 1. Well, it's something called Lifting the Veil, Selected Writings of Ismat Chugtai. And that was translated from the Urdu by Mohamed Asaduddin. That was an unexpected gem. One of those things that just happen, where you happen upon something that really blows you away with its quality. What happened was, there's a readathon called Lit with Indian Lit. I think it's Smriti from Sant Reads that organises it, but I saw it on Justness Bookscapades and thought it's about reading Indian fiction in not written in English, because lots and lots of, including lots of Indian readers, read sort of an awful lot of things that are written in English because it's, one sort of almost like, it makes sense maybe to write in English if you want to reach a wide audience, both within the Indian subcontinent and beyond. But there is so much rich literature written in the many, many languages of the Indian subcontinent. And so I thought, what can I find? And I found this book of stories by Ismat Chugtai, and what a phenomenal woman she was. So these book stories were mostly written in the 40s and 50s, and she was such a sort of a brave writer. She's writing feminist short fiction in a society that was perhaps not really ready for that. She actually ended up getting sort of prosecuted for what's the word, not blasphemy, but for immoral writing. They tried to ban it. So well written. If you haven't heard of Chugtai and you've never read anything by her, that's one to track down. Next group, drama. So I read 14 plays and 1 screenplay this year, and made, for most of those, discussing drama videos with Tilly. Of those 14, interestingly, only 2 were 5-star reads. I don't know if I'm more. Oh no, well, technically 3, but the third was Othello, and as I say, I'm not going to talk about rereads. But I do wonder if I'm more critical of players, or maybe as a reading experience, it's not so often a 5-star experience because it would be better to see it performed. But so that top 2, number 2 was Happy Days by Samuel Beckett. Now that reminded me, goodness me, what a gloriously odd writer of plays Beckett was. But how he can do such clever things with words. He really plays with language in a wonderful way. And he can, Happy Days, it's like a woman buried up to her, neck in sand, and, hardly anything happens. And yet it is full of drama and interest. So that was number 2. Number 1 was A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, and I was blown away by this play. Hansberry was a sort of pioneering, I suppose, groundbreaking black woman playwright in America. It was first performed in 1959. It is about, I guess it's about sort of racism, or, you know, and sort of urban life as a sort of for black families in the 1950s. And it's also about family, and it's brilliant. Yeah, if you read plays and you haven't read that one, go and read it. So where do we go next? Poetry. I read 17 books of poetry in the year, and there was a kind of quite a mix between collections of shorter poems and kind of long extended works, including sort of older ones. So I'm going to split this up a bit, because I had 8 5-star reads, and 4 of those were the longer things, and they ranged from Gilgamesh, which is sort of ancient Mesopotamian epic poetry. There are 2 different translations of that. I went to medieval Italy with Dante and Tom of LA books, and read the Inferno. I went to 17th century England and read Paradise Lost by John Milton. And then I came sort of up to date into the late 20th century and read Omeros by Derek Walcott, which is actually influenced by all the other 3, as well as by Homer, as you might guess. So, and is an epic poem set in his sort of home island of St. Lucia, and led to him getting the Nobel Prize. This was his sort of masterpiece, as it were. Now, how do you choose between Gilgamesh and Paradise Lost and, you know, Inferno, and it's a bit impossible to rate those 4. But I would say that my finest experience probably was reading the Divine Comedy, or specifically Inferno, because of reading it and having the benefit of Tom's videos. So that's my number 1 for the book length poetry. But what about shorter collections? Now, the shorter collections I read were mostly much more up to date. Not all of them. I did some so Victorian, some First World War poetry. But my 5-star ones, my 4 5-star ones, were all current. And I'm actually gonna put these in order bravely. So number 4 was The Historians by Eavan Boland. Now, and that came out in 2020. But it was the last book that she published before she died, in 2020, I think, or early 21. And it's got a selection of poems from her lifetime of writing, and then a section that is her last poems. And Boland is an important Irish woman poet, I would say. Her and the what you would go to her writing for, her sort of unique thing, I suppose, apart from just being a bloody good poet, is that she almost had a mission to sort of bring the ordinary Irish woman back into history, you know, to sort of their lives, give them honour in her poetry. And wonderful. That's number 4. Number 3 was a book that I read for Indigathon, and it's Whereas by Layli Long Soldier, and she's a Lakota poet, and she wrote this collection. It's perhaps the most experimental of the 4 collections that I'm going to talk about, and it was in part a response to the completely half-hearted apology from congressional apology in the United States to Native Americans for how they've been oppressed. And it's angry political poetry, but also beautifully written. That theme of kind of angry, or kind of political with a small p, poetry really runs through all these poetry collections I read, actually. And it's true of this, the number 2 of my 4. So number 2 was Daylight by Roya Marsh, and that came out in 2020 again. That is, she's writing, I suppose, about being a queer black woman in the USA today. So, I suppose what I would say about this and the one that I'm going to name as my number 1 is that they're poetry of ideas that are written with passion about those ideas, about issues like identity and so on, but they're not just vehicles for that. They're really inventive, poetic writing. What I liked about Daylight is her inventive use of rhythm and the way she plays with language, and that always is something I appreciate in poetry. But my number 1 collection of poetry, short poetry of the year, was this, Poor by Caleb Femi. This is a stunningly good book about, there he is, Femi, about growing up in Peckham, which is one of the most sort of economically deprived housing estates in London, in the UK, in fact, certainly in England. It's about being, what does it mean to grow up as a black kid, as a black boy and young man in somewhere like that, and it's illustrated with his wonderful photography as well. This is what it looks like, the Peckham estate. It's describing it like that makes it sound quite bleak, and actually at times it's heartbreaking, at times it makes you angry reading these poems, but it's also a beautiful experience reading this. There we go. So that brings us to non-fiction, and I'm going to tell you my top 10 non-fiction books of the year, and then that's where I'll take a break and we'll do novels in part 2. So, what a good year for non-fiction for me. I read 27 books of non-fiction, and this top 10 were all 5 stars. So although I'm going to start from 10 and go up to 1, and I don't want you to think that number 10 is not a brilliant book. These are my 5-star reads in terms of non-fiction. Number 10 is a book that I actually upgraded from 4 stars. So I sort of rated it as 4 stars when I finished it. But I would say literally, and I mean that in the literal sense, not, figuratively, I literally think of this book since I read it in June. Every time I go for a walk, an urban walk or a out in the countryside, this book comes into my mind. So I decided it's earned its 5th star. It's a book called Wayfinding by Michael Shaw Bond, came out in 2020, and the sort of tagline to the title explains it really well. It's the art and science of how we find and lose our way. It's all about the kind of the neuroscience of how we know where we are and find our way, and how we can learn it, what's innate. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and that's number 10. Number 9, completely contrasting, is A Little Book of Letters, a charming little book of letters, 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanth, and it's letters from an American woman, Helen, to a bookseller in London, and it's a book lover's book. And there's a group of booktuby women who read this every New Year's Day, and I read it on New Year's Day a year ago for the first time. Delightful. So that was number 9. Number 8. Number 8 is a book that came out again in 2020. Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes. Now, this is it's her examination of women in Greek mythology and Greek literature, ancient Greek. And what she brings to that book is a winning combination from my point of view, of a kind of feminist perspective, feminist eye, with really sound classical scholarship. And so she goes back and re-looks at those stories, and the way the versions of the women in the stories have been distorted by the retelling by sort of men over the centuries since, so that our idea of some of those characters is being fixed almost falsely compared with the rather more multifaceted Greek originals. Really interesting if you're into Greek mythology. Number seven is a memoir. It's called A Dutiful Boy by Mohsin Zaidi, and another 2020 book. And it's a book about growing up in a loving but strict Muslim family and realizing that you're gay, and how to kind of come to terms and live your life with those two things pulling you perhaps in two different directions. And it's about how he came good, really, how he came good in his career, in love, and ultimately also in his family relationships. And I think in describing that, you might think, oh, this is either going to be one of those sort of misery memoirs or one of those sort of inspirational uplift books. It's neither of those things. It's a lot more nuanced and interesting than that. Quite moving, though. Number 6 is perhaps a more conventional, factual non-fiction book, if you know what I mean. It's The Invention of Nature, and it's Andrea Wolf's loving celebration of the life and work and influence of Alexander von Humboldt, the sort of 18th and 19th century German naturalist and adventurer and writer. Just a real winner. I read it, I think at the time of Springathon. Yeah, great stuff. We've got to number 5, top 5. Okay. Number 5 is one of the few of these that I actually sort of own a paper copy of, and that's The Artful Dickens by John Mullen. And this is, well, you can see from the tagline, the tricks and ploys of the great novelist. And it's about how Charles Dickens used kind of incredibly inventive techniques to write his wonderful novels, and it kind of unpicks those one by one, and it is absolutely a wonderful book if you're a Dickens lover. Don't read it otherwise, just for Dickens lovers. Okay. That was number 5. Number 4 is a book that kind of slightly straddles the non-fiction fiction border, and it's a book that has been recommended to me so many times, and I finally got around to reading it. It's The Years by Annie Ernaux, and it translated by Alison Strayer, a brilliant translation, I thought. It originally came out in 2008, so it's not old, but it's not current, if you know what I mean. And it really is as good as all those people who recommended it to me told me it was. It's kind of memoir, but it's, rather than being her individual memoir, it's more a memoir of her generation of French women, and it's very it's like a mosaic, I would say, describe it as a book, but she's got a really good writing style. So that was number 4. We're getting close to the top now. Number 3 was another book that I've meant to read for some time that's been warmly recommended to me, and I'm now going to warmly recommend to you, and that's Chernobyl Prayer by the Belarusian journalist and writer and Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich. And it's her book about the nuclear reactor disaster at Chernobyl in 1986, and from 1996 onwards she went around kind of collecting, it's oral history, basically. It's a testimony of people who lived and worked in the area or were in some way involved in that disaster and its aftermath. It's a long book, and yet it reads really pleasurably, almost like, like a novel, it's yeah, it's although it is sad and scary at times, it's also funny and humane and a joy to read. So that was a long book. My top two, our last two books for this video, non-fiction choices, are both very short. Okay, this is number two. See, it's just a little book, and it's called The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd. Oh, look, it's so shiny that can you see that right? Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Now, this book was written in the 1940s. It was published in the 1970s, but it's really gained a new lease of life in the last few years. I think because of the enthusiasm there is now for writing about nature and the landscape. And so some of the people who do that now have championed this book as an inspiration to them, and I can see why, because it's just a gem of a book, a sparklingly lovely book. It's based on her observations when walking in the Cairngorm Mountains in Scotland, and it's about nature, it's about landscape. There's a bit of memoir in it, but it's really much more. It's impressionistic, and it is. This book is kind of on that cusp between prose and poetry. Beautiful, beautiful images and beautiful language. So, what beats that to be my number one non-fiction book of the year? It's another book that I've meant to read for so long and finally got around to, and boy, did it impress me when I did. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. Tiny book. It's basically 2 long essays put together in a book. It is one of the most influential books about race relations, and in particular race relations in America of the 20th century. And I knew that, which was why I wanted to read it. What I didn't know until I read it was just what a brilliant writer Baldwin is. It's one of the, I read this all the time I was reading this book, I was thinking, wow, this man can write. So that is why it gets to be my number one non-fiction book of the year. So that's where I'll stop for now, and I'll be back to talk about novels.